of flesh and blood.
Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. I thank you so much for joining us here on the program. We have a very special guest. Well, of course, you know I say that at the beginning of every program, but they're all special guests because they have something unique to offer us to think about, to ponder. I often feel as though after these programs, I have to take a breather. I have to go out and kind of do what Mary, the mother of Jesus, did, ponder the things that I've just heard and experienced. Well, today we're going to talk with Eli, and I believe it's Coberly. I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program, and his book, War in the Hearts of Men. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Richard.
And the subject actually has to do with something that most people probably aren't truly aware of, but they will be after this program. And it has to do with something that we talked about on this program 11, 12, even 13 years ago, not so much before that. And that is December, and I think it was the 12th, but anyway, it was in December of 2012, having to do with what was freaking everybody out like 12 years previous to that, Y2K. The Mayan calendar came to an end, as they say. I have to wonder, maybe there was a misinterpretation. But you look into not so much the calendar, but you've investigated and researched ancient civilizations, and you've come to a rather interesting conclusion. Talk to us about that as we get started here.
Well, in reference to time, most of the indigenous viewed time as cyclical as opposed to linear like the Western thought. So when you have that end of the world concept was more like the start of a new beginning of a new world, as opposed to just, it's all going to end, there's going to be a catastrophe. So time is more like a spiral than a line, and these ancient cultures like the Maya people would record it in through symbols and numbers and longer distance of time, like the Baktun, 144,000 years, illustrated by a symbol. I'm sorry, not years, days.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Right. And that seems to be a big bugaboo. I mean, I myself have a pet peeve about this whole daylight saving time business. And it's like, okay, Ben, back in your day, it may have worked fabulously. But here today, all I can say is cut it out. Stop it. We don't need it anymore. The animals don't even they're not aware of it. They don't care. And it's actually shown to be physically damaging and dangerous to human beings. And I mean, they've shown that death rates seem to go up, heart attacks seem to go up the Monday following the time change, whether you're going into daylight saving time or coming out. And I know that many, many other countries who did have it, they haven't had it for years because they realized we don't need it anymore. And that's just one aspect of time. And then, of course, there was, what was it? There was the Gregorian calendar for the West. And then we went to the I believe I'm correct, went to the Julian calendar. Mm-hmm. It's just, and trying to figure out how to calculate. I mean, there is someone who said there was no year zero, there was 1 BC and then 1 AD, or if you do the common era interpretations. But somehow, some way, these cycles, are these cycles that can be broken, or have you noticed that this is just the cycle that the human species is locked into?
Well, I mean, science certainly has a lot of stories about what really happened and with geology and those kind of things, but indigenous people have another story. So they've said there's been 4 worlds and this is the 5th world, and this is our last chance. So consciousness is through computers and technology has really arisen. So it shows now that we have more of an ability to understand the gravity of our choices as a society. So I feel that time is in a more conscious state these days.
Is it really? Be- Whoops, hold on just a moment. Something has kicked in here and it should not have. There we go. Has it really changed that much? I mean, it seems like it's gotten worse because of technology. We look at the polarization in this country and a lot of the upheavals. We've got Russia invading Ukraine. We've got all these other things. Or is it a perception that it's gotten worse because of technology? It really hasn't. And as you just stated, the consciousness of the planet has actually risen collectively.
I think you're right on both accounts. I mean, look at the algorithms of the news that you get, that you're sitting right next to someone and maybe you're on your smartphone and then someone right next to you has the same subject but a different news pattern. And why is that? Because we're being marketed by our conversations and our thoughts to come up with a certain outcome of our consciousness. So I would say that, everything's being recorded, injustices are being recorded, but the news tends to focus on fear. And so, computers have helped us notice more things that are wrong in the world or that are possible in the world, but they've also helped us stay fixated on the negative, I would say.
And that is certainly true. We're here in the West. I mean, I'm 62, be 63 this year. My father, who just passed, was 91. And I used to say that, I know my father is frustrated. I know that he is. I know that he feels, like the world that he is leaving his children and his grandchildren and even his great-grandchildren is worse off than it was when he was alive, in spite of the fact that he went through the Great Depression and so forth. And yet I'm glad you phrased it that way, that in spite of the fact that we're now over 8 billion human beings on the planet, by percentage, the kindness level based upon the population is probably at the same level or percentage wise, or maybe higher. And I have to say that when I go to YouTube in particular, and I start looking at some of these videos, I'll just, go sliding through some of these things, and the acts of kindness and consideration, saving of animals and people and so forth and so on, definitely does seem to be, I'm glad somebody's putting these up there. We're able to see these things. And I got to tell you, it warms my heart, makes me feel like there is hope. And it sounds like your research has shown that, yeah, there is hope. You say this is our 5th go around and this is our last chance. Do you have any answers to the question why it's our last chance? Why we got 5 strikes instead of 3?
There's nothing to really prove scientifically or logically, but you could go back to talking about Atlantis and the mythology behind that, and the connection of the Hopi people. I read about Four Corners region in Northwest North America, and those people talked about these ancients who were connected to this creator, and the creator gave them chances, right? Mm-hmm. And they continually got to this advanced stage in civilization and blew it every time. And so they say that, well, the creator, whoever that is, they don't say who he is or she is, but it came down to cataclysm and wiped out everything. And then we got to start again. And they said, well, this time it just says in the prophecies that we've had our last chance. And so it's kind of like, and even like Wandering Wolf, Guatemala, this guy that I used to study with, he talks about the ending of the age and the mass production of computers and cars and technology. And they say we've done this before. And ultimately I do write about how, imagine if the place is completely burned by volcanoes or major storms or lightning storms or solar flares. Imagine how hard it would be to find a piece of metal that was technology based. Like how are you going to find that if it just melts or it gets buried under the sea?
Interesting, because the thing that I find interesting, I was in this business of broadcasting. I worked for about 15 years for a Christian radio station, and I have to tell you that there came a point, and it was only probably 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 6 years into that stint, where I began to ask the question, is there something that I can do to help to bring about the Antichrist and Armageddon and all of these things? Because I want to tell you this, I'm bored with this story. I am absolutely bone dead bored. You've been telling the same story for 2,000 years. Could you get a little more creative? And then, of course, we have those people who want to predict. There was one guy by the name of Edgar Whisenant in 1988, believe it or not, who predicted Jesus would come back the 16th, 17th, or 18th of September that year. The 16th, 17th, and 18th came and went. No Jesus, at least not what they were expecting. So he disappeared for a few months, returned saying, my math was off. I forgot to carry the 1 or something. I don't know what it was. It's actually next year, 1989. September 1989 came and went, nothing. I looked him up a few years ago. He'd passed away in early 2000s. And I'm going, well, at least now he knows the truth, and we can get on with whatever. But people are still trying to figure out if and or when. So the other element of this too is, and I'm hearing from different people in different fashions in regards to this aspect that supposedly is part of, maybe it's in our DNA, this whole aspect of, as your title refers to, and or at least implies, war in the hearts of men. Some say, yeah, that's part of man's nature. Others say, no, it's not. It's something, it's an aberration. It's something, a pattern that we've sort of gotten locked into over the millennia. What is your theory, and or in terms of your research, is this imprinted in on our DNA that we don't have any other choice but to play these silly games, like, for example, in our modern day, Putin is playing?
Well, I mean, agriculture certainly played a role in all that. So you have, we got to farm crops and we got to make a big square and keep animals and people out of there, and people want in, and we're going to have kids to look after our big square, and those kids must be protected, and then those kids must protect us. And it's sort of like, that's a big piece of it too, is defending what's yours so you can eat and survive, and these rudimentary skills. But also it plays a bigger part is when you look at the solstices and the equinoxes, how the equinox are two polar opposites, and you have masculine and feminine ideas. The sun being the lunar and the sun being the masculine, and the moon being the feminine, because it's solar and lunar consciousness, right? And so the grander scheme is like, we have these two energies working in conjunction with these greater cycles that the Maya people talked about. And so those cycles can go in a spiral from masculine to feminine. And so if you talk about energy, what's energy? It's electricity, or it's how things move, or how you connect. Well, the polar energies of the earth are influencing us throughout grander cycles of time, and that's what the Maya people said. So ultimately, without being conscious, we're kind of succumb to whatever these energies are, and that's why if you say it's a spiral, maybe at the center it's in perfect balance. If time is a spiral and the center is perfect balance, then it spirals out, and you have more masculine, more masculine, more masculine. And then you see more times of dominance and war. And then you go closer to the feminine, and you see more times of doing what's best for the children, and those sort of nurturing capabilities. So the best thing that we can do, according to the indigenous, is understand the necessity for both. but also there was times where the Maya people would be like, all right, Venus is happening right now. It's really bright. Now's the time to go to war. We're planting crops right now because they look up at the stars and say now's the time, or they look at observe the cycles of the weather, and then this is the time for war, and then they make war.
Yeah, it is interesting, and of course that's what I've been hearing of late. And when I say of late, in the last few years, that this is not about the feminine coming and taking control. This is about working towards a balance between the feminine and the masculine energies. We're not talking about the sexes here. It's about the energies, and we're going to talk more about that as we continue here. I want to let you folks know we're talking with Eli Coberly. Do I have your last name pronounced correctly?
Yes. Yeah.
Eli Coberly, and his quest did not come from sitting in a library studying history. It began with his own harrowing experience, which we'll find out more about as a teenager, paratrooping, with seeing and experiencing needless neglect, emotional abuse, physical battering, and loss of life stemming directly from this social condition, as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host here on the program Tell Me Your Story. We're here with Eli Coberly. We're talking about the work that he has compiled in a book entitled War in the Hearts of Men. And we've kind of talked about sort of the energy and the spiral, the cyclical process, which is a spiral. It's not just a circle. And that we're looking for that balance, not only in our societies, Eli, but also in ourselves. Would you say that in particular, because it appears that you've studied more in regards to the Mayans, but also other indigenous peoples, specifically, I guess, of Central and South America?
Yeah, mostly in North America.
Yeah, and the continent. I'm wondering about, because this is one of the things that, it's like you've heard of the term critical race theory, right? I think it's incorrectly named. It should actually be the good, the bad, and the ugly of history. In other words, let's take a look at it all, okay? Don't judge it, okay? There's no reason to judge it. It is what it is. Man has done what man has done, okay? But it's important to look at it all. And it sounds like to me that's what you're doing. You're looking at all of it. As I would guess the Mayans did. That's where we come up with this whole cyclical aspect of life. Tell us a little bit about your beginnings that have led you to write this book, and of course to be here with us on this program, in terms of those experiences that you've had.
Yeah, well, I actually joined the Army when I was 15. My mom signed a note, and I left when I graduated. I was still 17. By the time I got done with all of my training, I was barely 18 and could buy cigarettes. And when I was honorably discharged, I was 20 years old and I couldn't legally drink alcohol. But in that time period, less than a year after I joined, they moved up my time to leave. I left 2 weeks after I graduated. It was supposed to be a month and a half. And it was right as the Khobar Towers were blown up. It was a giant thing in Saudi Arabia where people were doing paperwork for the government, for the U.S. interests. And so I was trained, and just a couple months after being at my unit, I was shipped off to Saudi Arabia to guard this giant compound of people doing paperwork, like thousands of people on this base altogether. But I'd say hundreds of U.S. Air Force doing paperwork, and then we had hundreds of people working around there, and we were guarding them all, and we were looking for bombs and threats, terrorist threats. But ultimately, what I saw was, huge oil tanks, and I would sit sometimes up under this camouflage net and glass them and make sure, okay, is anyone, putting a bomb on them or any of this? Also, McDonnell Douglas had these big jet air fighters. So basically, I was understanding something about how much interest we had in business with our government overseas, and just how big of a business it was, and just what my role was as a pawn in the game of colonization. And so then I thought, wow, I really want to study colonization after I got out, and I started going to Central America because it was wild and it was something where I could get away from the reality of what I had seen in my time of service.
Hmm. Well, and you've been able to travel, and it's interesting how, for example, my brother would travel the world. He worked for Disney, and he would travel to the countries where they were building the Disney amusement parks. It was France and China and so forth. And it tells me that, well, this is the greatest country in the world because I've lived in for a period of time these different countries, and it's just horrible and this and that and the other. And it's like, okay, well, I don't want to take that for granted, but by the same token, why are we not looking at, again, as I said before, the totality of our history, the totality of our present? But when have you done a research? Because I know you've done research in many other areas in regards to this subject. The Native American Indians, the North American Indians, and even the Canadians. I know there are native tribes up in Canada as well. I mean, the Americas, North, Central, and South, have had indigenous peoples for thousands of years. What stories, what information, what prophecies, if you will, have you found that continue to corroborate these independent sources that seem to speak of the same things?
Well, like I was saying earlier, the Hopi people, the Navajo kind of talk about that too, the fifth world. But also the Maya people is the same story. They have, and ultimately a lot of their DNA is the same and also their trade routes. But there's a much older story to all of it. If you look into stuff like the Kennewick Man in Washington along the Columbia River, my grandfather did a lot of those digs, finding the ancient arrowheads and things like that, spear points that were much older and from other locations and all this stuff. So I think there's a lot of prophecy around, and actually in Pyramid Lake, I'm writing for my next book, Pyramid Lake in Reno, outside of Reno, is they have a prophecy about just being ending up there on a big, like holding on to a raft or something and just ending up there. From a giant flood. So a lot of the cataclysms, the flood stuff, like from Noah at that time, and it's been around for a really long time, and they all talk about it.
Interesting. Do they coincide in any way with, for example, with biblical, or I don't know if Islam and the Quran have prophecies, some of the other philosophies around the world? Are there correlations there, or are they somewhat divergent in their assessment of the future of man and the planet?
Honestly, every single one of them, including the Jewish tradition and Dome of the Rock and Islam and all that. I'm not sure about Islamic stuff. I haven't studied a lot of that. But what I will say is everyone is waiting for a white Messiah like Jesus to save the world. The Hopi called the Pahana, the Central Americans, they got tricked so many times by some white guy showing up. Oh, he's got a beard and he has a cross, because they already had the cross woven into their symbology and their religion. And so it's like when everyone showed up with a cross, they just welcomed him in and said, this is the great white brother kind of thing, boy, were they wrong.
Yeah. Unfortunately. What about your own personal philosophy? Where did you start as a child growing up? Your parents, what did they teach you or introduce you to, and how has that developed over the years to where you are today?
My parents were like Jesus freaks. My dad was he was a teenager, and he was taking LSD and hitchhiking up and down the coast of California. And then he found Jesus because he needed, I think, that to get along, and my parents met, and so it was like that's what they were into, and I was like, whoa, wait a second, like I was in a church, everyone's speaking tongues and running out and singing in the aisles, and it just didn't make sense to me. I wanted something greater, and my grandfather on his deathbed, he said, I said, what do you believe in, heaven and hell and all this stuff? I asked him, and he said, Eli, there's other things in this world than you know, and there's other dimensions, and it's not like you've been told. And that was something that stuck in my mind. And growing up in a town of 200 people, you're either a farmer or a logger. My grandpa said that, and he was into, like I said, archaeology and all this. He was teaching geology at Western in Bellingham, Washington, where I grew up.
We're talking with Eli Coberly here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we're talking about war in the hearts of men, and that is kind of where it resides. The one thing I think I really do like about the Jewish tradition in my conversations with rabbis in particular is that, and even in my own research, that when you read about Satan or the devil or evil and so forth, the Jewish tradition doesn't teach that there is a literal Satan. Now, there may have been an angel by the name of Lucifer, but the reality, according to Jewish tradition, is that is the lowest base nature of man. It is not outside of us. It's within us, but it kind of goes to that Native American story about the black and the white wolf and which one will win the battle. It depends upon which one you feed. Do we feed the warlike, the lower base nature of man, or do we feed the higher levels, the higher consciousness of man? Is that kind of what you have found over the years?
Yeah, I mean, Joseph Campbell talks about the necessity of darkness and the shadow self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what he's saying is that you can't have one without the other. Polarities are necessity for transformation and understanding of the true self, the true nature. And so if you deny those, the understanding of the darkness, and you always just feed the light, then you might be delusional. But if you're always feeding the dark, then you might not ever get to the light.
Interesting also how you, I actually love this about the research you've done. You've incorporated, you've studied, you've researched numerology, symbology, vibrational resonance, and sacred geometry, and they all demonstrate that the shaman, the wise men, and perhaps some unique race have appeared in many seemingly unconnected places that have found a way to access the timeless knowledge and potential available to all in the Akashic records or the energetic archives, which I find so fascinating because there's another element too that I've stayed away from for a long time, but I've delved more into it as the years go by because it's almost inescapable, and that is the influence of otherworldly beings. I'm not talking about supernatural, spiritual kinds of things. I'm talking about, well, for lack of a better term, extraterrestrials, ETs, aliens. What, if any, information do you have in that regard to their influence, their awareness of these prophecies, of the cycles that the human race has been going through for, as you say, the fifth and final time, ladies and gentlemen? Any insight at all, or is that all just kind of, I don't want to go there because that's just a little too far out?
Well, I kind of, when I wrote the book, it was about a lot of different ideas that people were kind of afraid to talk about. So I don't have a problem talking about it. The Paracas people of Peru, that's something that is really popular these days with those shows like Ancient Aliens, all this kind of stuff. And there's one guy, Brian Forrester, who really kind of pioneered the idea behind some findings in the early 1900s that on the shores of Paracas of these elongated skulls. The sagittal suture was missing, and they had a larger skull by volume. And people continually try to prove that these are just cradle boarding, like when they'd smash the kid's head when it was malleable to make it pointed up to look like royalty. Well, who is the royalty? That's the question they often ask. But and so I was interested in it, and I went and I saw a conference, and I saw them speak along with the astrophysicist and geneticist, he said they took the test and it was something that was not human, as we know it. Now, granted, it might have been mixed with human DNA, but it was something different. But since it destroys the narrative based on science of the Christian religion or society and our colonization, no one wants to talk about it. But the reality is a scientist said that the DNA from these skulls was something different. So, and we've been finding stuff like that all around the world for a long time that isn't quite the same species as us.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's lots of other examples. So I think that it's just good to have an open mind, but also not believe everything you hear too.
Yeah. I know that we've had Greg Braden on this program. He's a little more difficult to get a hold of these days because I guess he's just too darn busy, but we used to be interviewing him pretty regularly, and he would talk about this one thing they discovered over in, I think it was the either India or somewhere in that far region from where we are, where they were able to basically theorize with pretty much some accuracy that we've been around a few times, because they found this huge area where the sand had been turned to glass. So now what you do is you say, okay, well, now how hot does it have to get before you turn that sand into glass? And let me tell you, it's between 18 and 2200 degrees. I know this because I have a glass blowing friend who has his shop here in Santa Barbara. He's a master craftsman, and he has two different chambers with the glass material that he puts in there to heat it up, to melt it in order to be able to start making the things that he makes. Well, what on earth would have caused an entire area, and we're talking miles across, to turn to glass? And the only conclusion they could come to was something akin to our modern day atomic bomb. And so that, and then that opens up the old Pandora's box of, okay, well, who was fighting and where did they come up with all of this stuff, and on and on and on. I even have another friend who theorizes that there was a battle out in space. The craters on the moon were made by the hurling of small pieces of asteroid and so forth at the Earth, and they would hit the moon. That's also how we have the meteor crater, for example, in Arizona, my home state. Also, the Gulf of Mexico was supposedly created by a massive meteor, because you just take a look at the shape. Of course, then people ask, well, where's the meteor? You got the hole. Where's the big ball that made the hole? It disintegrated, and so on. And so there are all these different theories. And then you have, the theories about the reptiles and the little, the little people or something like that, little aliens, and on and on and on. And then there's this other question about our technology. Did we really come up with this stuff? I mean, the transformation from, like, for example, a crystal radio set to be able to listen to audio on our smartphones. Really, we came up with that? I'm somewhat skeptical. What are your thoughts in that regard to our being influenced technologically by outside sources?
I don't know a lot about technology. I do know about crystals. I have hundreds of crystals in my room. I do believe in what I do know is that they are used for storing information. And, there's a thing about the crystal skulls. It was big with the Maya concept. There's 13 of them. And they were lost in different locations and they were found. And I do know that crystalline energy stores memory. And to me, it made sense when I thought about how the crystals were formed. So many years ago, and what was the vibration of the thought of whatever animals were around, or what was the vibration of what was going on in the planet, or that kind of thing. And maybe that was trapped in there. So that's kind of how I understood it. But also I understand it from, like, I've read about Edgar Cayce. I've read most of his books.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the world's still most renowned psychic of all time. And he studied the Akashic records and he accessed them. And I learned how to access the Akashic records as well. I believe that there's, like the ancient India people say in the Vedic tradition, there's an ether, and within that ether, there's memory stored from all time and space. And so I think you can access that. Beethoven wrote symphonies in his dreams, those kind of things.
Oh yeah, it's amazing what we can access. We've had people on talking about the Akashic records. I'm just curious. Do you have your library card for the Akashic records? I haven't gotten mine yet, but I find it fascinating. I'm not being flippant or disrespectful by any means. It's just that there is so much that we have access to through so many different means, including those that I mentioned earlier that you have incorporated and have put together. Like again, numerology, symbology, the vibrational toning, and so forth. We've had, for example, Jonathan Goldman on this program talking about the importance, the healing properties of humming, of just humming. As a kid growing up, for me, it was moaning. When I didn't feel good, I moaned, and my mother said to one of my sisters, who had said, "Mom, make him stop. He sounds horrible." She's, "No, that's how he heals himself." And it was amazing. My mother said that. And again, this was back when I was a child, back in the 60s, early 70s, that she was aware that was a thing. And yet there's, you think that Google has all this information that's available to you. That's a tip of the iceberg, it seems like, to what's out in, shall we use the term, out in the ethers through crystals or through any other method.
Yeah, I mean, one example is I'm writing my next book. It's a dystopian sci-fi, but it talks about a lot of this. And I honestly, I'm not really coming up with a storyline. I wake up and I have dreams about where I'm stuck, and then I begin to type. I don't believe that that's an accident. I don't believe that was something that, it's not from me. It's like we're just sort of channels for what our gifts and our arts are and what our potential is. I don't see any problem with that. It's pretty basic to me. I can talk about it like it's the weather, but it's I don't know what to say about that besides what I did.
Well, I have to say that I've always loved sci-fi. One of my favorites, of course, was the Dune trilogy, and I thought it was very cool when they made it into a movie, actually several, because I thought, man, what a mind Frank Herbert must have to come up with the intricacies of all of the different institutions that we have, like the religious, the political, the educational, the economic, and so on and so forth. And I just thought, wow, amazing. But I've always loved science fiction, partly because with science fiction, there is a certain element of science fact. And as more time, as man calculates it and keeps track of it, goes by, less and less is science fiction and becomes science fact. And that's what's fascinating to me, is that someone says, that seems like a neat, I have an idea for how I can make that a reality. Like in Star Trek, the original series, you had those rather thick tablets that they carried around, and then they would still use a stylus to sign and so forth. And now what do we have? We have these smartphones where you don't even need a stylus. You just use your finger. And now they're getting to the point where I believe they have these glasses. Now, I remember years ago, Google came out with these glasses that didn't go that far, but they're sort of reinventing them. And they're basically, you can use your eye to move the cursor and to go this place and that place. That's going to take a lot of training, I would think, but that it's like, wow. Incredible. And eventually, what do you think? Eventually, maybe we won't even have to move anything. We'll think it, and it happens on the screen. Just a thought.
When I was younger, I thought a telepathic credit card would be nice. I don't know why, but
Well, yeah, and in a way, I would have to say that auto pay on those credit cards is sort of telepathic of a sort. It's one you don't like to think about, but you see it when your numbers start to go down and you're paying that back. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's these ideas that we come up with.
I just think that.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, as far as the DNA part of it all, and other galaxies and all this stuff, I think that if we can influence DNA how we do now here, what's to say that other DNA hasn't been influenced on other planets, other locations, and here before? If technology moves so rapidly, I think that people could understand that that's a possibility.
We are talking with Eli Coberly, and a fascinating conversation. War in the minds of men, in the hearts of men. Well, could be too. But his book is titled War in the Hearts of Men. As we continue here on Tell Me Your Story, I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and Eli Coberly is my guest, author of fascinating book, War in the Hearts of Men. Hope that you will pick up a copy of it. I've always been intrigued by native civilizations, indigenous in particular. I had the great pleasure back in, I want to say 1994. I should be specific since we're in a new century, because they may think, oh, you're that old, 1884? No. Went on a cruise, a Western Caribbean cruise that stopped off at on the coast where you found the Tulum ruins. I've heard of the Chichen Itza ruins and many others. And first thing that went through my mind was, why is it that the philosophical groups, religions, if you will, always manage to get the good oceanside property? Because it was right there. It's right there on the hillside of the ocean. We have, for example, here in Santa Barbara, we have Santa Barbara Mission, and it overlooks the ocean. Again, another prime piece of property. But it was rather interesting to walk through the ruins. And then when I went to Ireland, my wife was intrigued by the cemeteries. And at first I thought, that's kind of depressing, until I started to think about it from this perspective. Love to have your talks, your input on this. These cemeteries are filled with the people who built the civilization that exists today. And without these people, who in this case are laying in the ground, this place wouldn't exist. The civilization would not exist. And so forth. So it's, and I have to question this whole business of digging, the whole archaeological thing. And when they dig up the bones, I'm thinking, okay, so how long do you have to wait before you can dig up the bones in a cemetery? 10 years, 100 years, 500 years? Because, I don't want them to go necessarily to go digging up my grandmother or my grandfather, and yet we do it constantly to native people's burial sites. What's your thought in that regard to not only the impact of past generations of these indigenous peoples, and they're responsible for who and what we are today only by virtue of the fact that they kept the culture going, okay? But also then this other aspect of being more respectful of these sites? Or is that irrelevant in that this world, being it temporal, because then we dip into the spiritual world, that's what's more important than the physical world? What are your thoughts?
I mean, obviously it's just a shell, and the body for the soul. Most religions can account for that, but there's still a connection in the heart of the mind of the people. They And it depends on the ancestors ultimately. Like in Central America, a lot of Maya people don't have a problem with their ancestors being dug up for studying, and many of them are involved and employed as such. But like if you go to Washington State, where I grew up, and I was talking about the Kennewick Man, that was a major catastrophe socially, because eventually the people had the skeleton put back into the ground because it was their ancestor, they claimed. But also the scientists that was studying it proved that it wasn't. But also the National Guard or whoever it was, Army Corps of Engineers had a salmon agreement spawning on the Columbia there. They had an agreement with them. So a lot of it gets political, and not all of it is just sentiment. A lot of it is about, okay, we want to make a deal with them about the salmon, so let's let them put the skeleton back in the ground, even though the skeleton was proven to be from Japan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, but here's the thing: you dig up anybody's bones, yes, it was somebody's ancestor. Whether you knew them and you revered them or not, it's somebody's mother, father, sister, brother. I know too that some of the discoveries they made in regards to, for example, the eruption of Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius, and how many people were literally frozen in a position, as they were running or what have you. And then there were others who were huddled with their children, and which was just amazing. And certainly that gives us an historical perspective on what happened and what can happen if something like, well, let's say Mount St. Helens a few years back erupts. And I know that, we have the Ring of Fire with all of these different volcanoes in different places. And I mean, it's just amazing. But, I guess maybe there's a certain element of, well, we don't respect them when they're alive, so why should we respect them when they're dead? It's like, please, we can change that. And that's another question I've got for you in regards to the DNA. From your perspective, do you think that we can indeed, shall we say, overwrite or rewrite our DNA so as to really shift away, or is it still just going to be this cyclical thing that we find ourselves in that is giving us the biggest challenge of all to find that balance between the masculine and feminine energies?
Yeah. I mean, psychology helps. That's a real linear way to get through that, is to understand the mistakes of your parents or your ancestors and heal that within yourself. But also, I think a valuable thing is the tools that the indigenous did use, and that was plant medicine. The problem is people will want to take the psychedelics or the plant medicine too often and use it like, oh, well, I got to change my mood, or I want to feel good this weekend, or instead of like set and setting like Ram Dass or Timothy Leary suggested. Having it, what it does is it rewires, in particular ayahuasca, it rewires your mind to think more holistically about your DNA, and it may change the DNA. I'm not a scientist, I don't know. But what I have noticed in myself and others is after trying it, I noticed a major shift in the way I looked at relation. And I noticed I had visions about my past ancestors and how they had made mistakes, but it wasn't their fault. But it was my duty, if I was aware of it, to change my relation to people. And I think that's a valuable tool that's happening right now, and especially for veterans with PTSD and those kind of things. But it also is like any other thing that influences your mind or your body. It's a toxin, and people use the toxin in excess to escape.
Yeah.
So
War in the Hearts of Men chronicles Eli Coberly's adventures from a mock battlefield of Fort Bragg and deserts of Saudi Arabia, to the hidden jungle pyramid, to sacred caves, to ceremonial rituals with Mayan priests and more, and the answers that came with those exploits. when not on his hunt for answers and that drive mankind towards enlightenment and peaceful coexistence. Eli is a yoga therapist in Northern California, here in our home, our state, as we speak. And you are listening to Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. And Eli, this is a fascinating conversation, and there's so much to talk about. And you mentioned, of course, psychedelics. I never was interested that much in, for example, any kind of drug usage. My peers in high school in particular, I know that they were at least marijuana, but maybe even something harder. I didn't try any of that stuff, not because it was illegal or that it was bad for me. It just didn't interest me. But I saw this DVD on ayahuasca, and it's the first time that I have ever wanted to experience that under the conditions that this DVD showed. It was a controlled environment. There were people around. They were there to keep you safe, and so forth. And the one thing that intrigued me more than anything else was this one man's experience when he began to tell the story. And it's, oh my gosh, and so many days went by, and this and that and the other. How long was I gone? 10 minutes. And it begins to show you that time is irrelevant. Who cares about daylight saving time? It's a construct in the minds of men. Yeah, we can map it by the cycles of the sun coming up in the east and going down in the west. But still, it's if you were out in space, you wouldn't even notice it. You wouldn't even notice day and night. It would all be the same. I'd be like, for example, if you were on the moon, if you're on the moon, there is no change because the moon is always facing the Earth. To me, it's kind of fascinating. Although I guess you might see the spinning of the Earth, that kind of thing. But what, you mentioned about the psychedelics being used to help veterans with PTSD, which I'm glad they're finally doing something in that regard, because these people who have made the choice, such as yourself, to serve in that capacity, it's almost as if the government says, hey, we need you, come on over here, and this is what we'll give you, and so forth. And of course they don't tell you this. By the way, when you come back, we're not going to be here to help you. It's almost, even though there is the VA, I get that, but it's like there are so many stories of veterans who they don't get the help that they need. And I'm just glad that there are people in the private sector who are beginning to, that have been working certainly for a long time, but they're really beginning to pressure the government to allow them to use these things that in moderation will really help. What are your it sounds like you're certainly in favor of that as well. You've kind of alluded to that in our conversation here.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was that I would have liked a more structured situation when I tried the plant medicine. And I think a lot of veterans in my case would need that. And I'm glad that there are advocacy groups that are into that, because you take one person who's like, oh, my mom was mean to me. And then you take another person who is like, I saw some dead bodies on the drop zone. And what it's a little bit different situation. And you have a guy who's like, maybe he's a gringo shaman or something like that, and he's shaking a tambourine and he's really honestly trying to help. But is he equipped with the knowledge of a psychotherapist, or does he have a contingency of a doctor there to take care of people who's sober? So I think that's really good, and I totally advocate it. One group, No Fallen Heroes, this he's a pilot, a fighter pilot, and I hope he gets me on his show. Actually, I would like to be on his show as well. But anyway, he's going to DC and he's advocating for veterans. So I think it's a good thing, but I don't think that, again, that people should be doing it all the time. I think it's a very special, sacred thing that should be taken seriously.
I like the way you phrase that, a special, sacred thing. I know that with the DVD that I watched again regarding ayahuasca, that's how they treated it. This was not just something that you just, here, give me a cup, drink it down, and I'll have my trip, and then I'll go home. It doesn't work that way. And I have to ask you also in that regard, your feelings in regards to ritual and tradition and ceremony in our lives. Do you feel that the indigenous peoples of our past, the Mayans, the Hopis, and all of the others, because they had that, it was part of their culture. But here in the West, I've heard people, specifically whites, complaining about how their culture is being taken away. Now, I'm one of them, but I don't believe that. Well, what have you incorporated into your life to help to foster the maintenance, if you will, maintaining of your culture? What have you done to do that? Because it's not up to somebody else, it's up to you. What are your thoughts in the regards to ritual, tradition, and ceremony in our day-to-day lives?
Well, I think they help us slow down, and if nothing else, relax the nervous system, which is continually reacting to experiences in an oftentimes fight or flight scenario. I feel that, and also that it's a reset. You do something like maybe you pray with a rosary, or you count the mala beads from India, or you do the fire ceremony with the Maya people. You're getting back to what's more important, and oftentimes it's grounding into the earth, and it's actually energetic. When you ground into the earth, you're holding your electrical charge is strong, and it's real. That's scientific. We're made of water, and it's electricity. And so when we relax and calm, then we're doing something for ourselves and others, really. And I think it's valuable.
Yeah. My wife in particular, she has experienced all kinds of problems with computers at her work, wherever she's worked, and she just doesn't understand it. Well, it's because somehow you managed to alter your electrical charge that has some kind of an influence on that computer. Nobody else seems to have any problems, but every so often, not all the time, every so often, she will experience some quirk in her computer that she's working on. Well, it stands to reason that you'd have an impact. I mean, we've even heard of people who have had certain metals put in their teeth,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll pick up radio stations. They'll pick up audio signals, I mean, that's a real thing. Not so much today because they're not using metal in the mouth so much anymore, but in years gone by. Fascinating incorporation of different things. Do the Mayans hold a fascination with you to the extent that you maybe one time you were of the Mayan people? Is that kind of where the connection is, or indigenous peoples in that regard?
You mean as far as I think I'm reincarnated from
Yeah.
I know that my birthday is astrologically the same. Well, one, I was born on the day out of time, which is in the Maya calendar. It's like sort of like the beginning of their cycle, I think. I don't quite understand that exactly, but I do know that my birthday is astrologically similar to the first day of their calendar. And that's what my astrologer told me, because I was like, I'm curious about this. And I just asked, and 3114 BC is at this time, August 11th. It's the same as my birth chart. Pretty similar.
Now, I'm curious, the Mayan calendar isn't, X number of days in the week and weeks in the month and months in the year. It tracks more from a cyclical standpoint in terms of, let's say, Mother Earth and the summer, winter, spring, and fall kind of thing?
No, there's a lot more to it. You have a 260 day, and then whatever 365 is minus 260. There's another separate part of it.
Okay.
And that was more Aztec influenced. And then you have this other thing, the Hob and I forget the other one, but they're two combined make the 365 day year. But what you have is you have the narwhals, and those are it's like animism. So they're little animals that represent the energy and the tone of spectrum of the days and when you were born, and months and days and years and time periods. There's a lot to it. I couldn't begin to tell you the whole.
Well, maybe we'll save that for another 2 or 3 programs or something.
Right.
But it is fascinating to see that. I know that I was a Baha'i back in the 90s for about a year and a half, and they had I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 or 5 days in their calendar. They referred to them as intercalary days. There was no leap year, you know. That's just how it mapped out, and that was rather interesting to see that each of these different philosophical systems, in some instances, not all, have their own timekeeping, their own calendar, if you will, and it's like, wow, where did this come from? Where? In terms of where this information comes from, certainly you referred to the Akashic records in particularly, but what about this aspect that is spoken of more so only because of my knowledge of it in the Christian tradition, the Christian philosophy, the still small voice and that inner life? Can you talk to us a little bit about how that translates to some of these other ancient philosophies and traditions?
When you say inner life, what do you mean?
Listening, going within,
Yep.
being still and quiet, and listening for and listening to that still small voice.
I like, the Vedic tradition talks about the self, the Atman, the true self. I think that's all that is the I don't know that it's God or creator, or I couldn't prove it or anything like that. You know, you have spirit guides, or you have, some people say a Native American guy with a headdress talks to them, or whoever, and some people have voices inside their head. It's like, so psychologically, I don't know what that is, but I believe there's a true self and a true wanting and desire that's coming out, like full potential. And I think that's, for me, is what I always thought that was, like something's a higher self speaking to you as to a better choice or a better option.
Interesting. So you have another book, you say, that's coming out, that you're working on, I should say.
Yep.
Title for it yet?
Yeah. Hashtag artificial antiquity. Hopefully no one takes the name yet.
I hear you. No, I hear you. Yeah, you want to grab those titles as quickly as you can. I was lucky enough some 15, 16 years ago, I was able to get my website, my name. So I was like, wow, it's still available, because I've Googled myself and I found that there are a lot of Richard Dugans, not necessarily with the middle name of my father, but nonetheless, so I grabbed it right away and off we went. This is really interesting, Eli. Eli Coberly is my guest, and we're talking about his book in particular and the subject matter and all of the ancillary conversation regarding war in the hearts of men. War in the Hearts of Men's the title of the book. And besides his own curiosity, he spent his life traveling, following the various clues we've kind of talked about. And you've been quoted here as saying that, and this is to me fascinating, transformation through mythological symbolism can unlock our perception of who we think we are and propel us into who we are destined to become. I believe that humanity's struggles, plural, have taken place so that we might become closer to our essence, which leads me to this question. We know about all of these we know about many of these different prophecies and all of this information. So if this is our 5th time around, and there are those who hope that we succeed this time and make it through, is what the human race has been going through, what we've been going through shall we say, if we were looking at a map, preordained, but what isn't is how we respond to those challenges. It's like going into one of these escape rooms, you have to find the clues. It's all already been set up, but it's how you figure it out that is what's really important.
Yeah, I would say that the reaction, like what you're doing about it, what the reaction and the action. So how you're perceiving it, and if you're perceiving it as a threat rather than an opportunity, you might be wasting your time. And I think that honestly, this was all put in front of us so we could become better humans, better souls, better workers of light, things like that.
And this may be irrelevant, but do you think that that we are not, as human beings, we are not indigenous to this planet?
Yeah, I honestly, now that I'm researching more and more, and at first I was like, oh, the jury's out, but I would say it's more of a possibility than anything, especially how big the universe is, and especially once you study other galaxies like the Andromeda galaxy, that big spiral that you see in the north, fall time. Those kind of things, you can't. There's way too much space and matter out there, and way too much of a span of a time, and way too much evidence pointing towards more than the last 2,000 years and a Messiah at that point.
That's another interesting element there too, that in terms of we're waiting around for something to come. And there are people who predict, as I mentioned earlier, and some of the conversations I've had on this program are leaning more towards, you know what, that may or may not be true, but in this here and this now, it's really not important. It's kind of irrelevant. But I also know too that we are always looking for signs. And I know just recently I saw a photograph or a picture. I don't know if it was the one, but there has been a white buffalo born somewhere. They did not reveal where because they didn't want people to poach it. But the Native American traditions speak about what a white buffalo means. I don't know what it means exactly, but it's supposedly a good omen. But we're always looking for these signs. Do these different traditions, including the Mayan, give us any signs, anything we should be looking out for in terms of whether or not we've figured it out or not, that will tell us, okay, we won't have to go around a sixth time because there isn't going to be a sixth time. We're going to make it this time. We're going to succeed and it's going to be okay. Or we blew it. We've already gone past the point of no return, and we might just throw up our hands and forget about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring up white buffalo calf woman prophecy. That's something that I'm writing about in my next book. That prophecy right there holds a lot of water when it comes to the future of our species, I believe, and it says a lot about symbology and through the chakras and things like that, and the ancient sites around the world. But I believe that there's probably going to be a time where people realize the potential of technology as a way to means for an end, and not just the technology like we have on our screens, but more like the technology of the ancients that was already available if we paid attention. It's a little out there, but it could be possible. And I think people like and it, this is controversial maybe, but like Elon Musk, if he's whatever you think about him, however you feel about him, he's a guy who said he cares about the planet and it's public and he has lots of money. And so people are complaining in certain facets, but if there's more and more people saying, I want to do something that's good for the planet, whether or not they're right or righteous, that's a good sign. And the people with lots of money, if they say we want to do something good, that's never been done before.
My guest is Eli Coberly. The book is entitled War in the Hearts of Men, and this is Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we are talking with Eli Coberly about his book and the website that we want to send you folks to, which, by the way, Eli, we will be linked to, and we're going to have folks go there. It's elicoberly.com, elicoberly.com, where you can find out more about the work that he is doing, the book that he has written. And, we're talking about, war and competition, subjugation. Well, it's the engine that's run the world since the dawn of agriculture, and the sublimation of the feminine and illusory principle of separation. And of course, in his latest work, War in the Hearts of Men, he traces how we arrived at a world where men feel compelled to dominate, to hide their tenderness and compassion, to show their toughness, and to propagate war, and how this is leading the planet directly down a path of self-destruction. Final question in this regard, Eli. Are we, in your estimation, and based upon the signs that the prophecies speak of in the traditions you have researched thus far, are we going down that path of self-destruction? Have we gone to the point of no return, or is that still up for grabs as of yet?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. So in other words, we still have a choice to make.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like if it's inevitable that people die, everyone's going to die. And that's why we have religion, and choices are made on the grander scale. And there's not much that we can do about it, except for individually, and then hopefully whatever we do individually will be collective over the long term for a better world.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us so much time here on the program, and I'm hoping that we have covered the significant points on this to educate people as well as to enlighten them and interest them in continuing to follow up by getting in touch with you through your website, or for that matter, getting a copy of your book, War in the Hearts of Men. And I thank you so much for being a part of this program.
Thank you, Richard.
I do have 3 final questions for you, though.
Yep.
And I ask all of my guests, and we've been doing that for 15 years. But before I do, I want to thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. We are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And we are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Wednesdays for a special edition of Tell Me Your Story. We podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and many other locations on the internet, too numerous to mention. And you can watch these interviews on YouTube. We hope that you will do that, and also select notification so that you will know when we post a new conversation on the website. We also ask that if you can do so to support us financially, we can use all the help we can get, and we thank those who have already helped us and those who will. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. And when you go there to contribute, just put in my email address, which is richard@richarddugan.com. It'll help to take care of the costs that we incur through the podcasting services and the website and on and on. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And please spend time during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, going within and listening to and following the promptings of that still small voice. With all of that said, we now go to our final 3 questions for our guest. And the first of those 3 questions is, who is Eli Coberly?
He's a regular man going through time and space in a meat suit. He's just like everyone else, but he's a guy who decided to live up to his full potential and explore some big questions about himself and try and set an example for others. I'm a writer, and I grew up in a small town, so I'm really don't have much of an education, but I took the time to educate myself about the world.
Well, we are certainly glad that you did, and to do the research that you've done. We appreciate it. Next question is, what is your life's purpose?
I believe my life's purpose is to help people with their dreams, and if their dreams include becoming closer to themselves, then that would be wonderful.
And finally, what was your best day?
I think when my daughter was born. She was born 4 years ago.
Once again, Eli, we thank you for being with us here on the program. This has been a really educational and enlightening experience for me, although I'm familiar with much of what you have spoken about here. But I'm just glad that we were able to bring it to the public, because you have tied so many of these different elements together that it's about time somebody did that, because there's a certain synchronicity, there's a certain connectedness, not only to all of these different traditions, but also to us. And we thank you for connecting with us today.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me.
And I thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, where we are giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next podcast, videocast. Love to Lal. Jeanette, I am listening. And Dad, be happy.